I never meant to fall in love with the ferryman's son. But then again, I suppose no one ever really means to fall in love at all. It just happens, quietly, like the way dawn breaks over the harbor, so gradual you don't notice until suddenly everything is illuminated and you can't remember what the darkness looked like anymore. His name was Marco, and he rowed the ferry between our island and the mainland 6 days a week, just like his father had done and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of strong arms and weathered hands, pulling tourists and locals across that narrow strip of water that separated our world from everything else. But Marco, he was different from the others. He understood something about time that most people never learn. I first noticed it on a Tuesday in late September. I'd been coming to the island for 3 months by then, renting a small cottage on the eastern shore while I figured out what to do with my life after everything fell apart back in the city. My therapist had suggested a change of scenery. My ex-boyfriend had suggested I get my shit together. I'd decided the island was a good compromise between their competing visions for my future. That particular Tuesday, I had no appointments, no obligations, nothing pulling me toward the mainland except restlessness and the vague sense that I should be doing something productive with my day. I showed up at the dock at 10 in the morning with a backpack and no real plan, just another lost soul looking for purpose in motion. Marco was there, coiling rope in the stern of the ferry, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he worked. He looked up when my footsteps echoed on the wooden planks, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges that made my chest feel strange. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying that slight accent that marked him as a true islander, someone whose family had been here long enough to develop their own way of shaping words. "Morning," I replied, stepping aboard. There were only 2 other passengers that day, an elderly couple who immediately claimed the bench at the front, holding hands like they'd been doing it for 50 years and still found comfort in the gesture. I took my usual spot on the side bench, expecting the crossing to take the standard 15 minutes it always did. Marco untied the moorings, pushed off from the dock, and began to row. But something was different. His strokes were slower, more deliberate. Each pull of the oars seemed to take a breath longer than necessary. The ferry moved through the water like honey, like time itself had thickened around us. I watched him row, the way his shoulders moved under his faded blue shirt, the concentration on his face that seemed directed at something beyond just the physical act of moving us across the water. 20 minutes passed, then 25. The elderly couple didn't seem to notice. They were lost in their own world, pointing at seabirds and murmuring to each other. But I noticed, and when we finally reached the mainland dock, 32 minutes after we'd left, Marco caught my eye as I stepped off the ferry. There was something in his gaze, a question or maybe an answer, I couldn't tell which. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was thanking him for. He nodded, that same almost smile playing at his lips. "See you on the way back." I spent the day wandering the mainland town, buying groceries I didn't really need, sitting in a cafe drinking coffee that tasted like every other coffee I'd ever had. But my mind kept drifting back to the ferry, to those extra 17 minutes, to the way Marco had seemed to be rowing not just through water, but through something deeper, something more essential. The return trip that evening was different. There were 8 other passengers, all tourists heading back after a day of sightseeing, chattering about the restaurants they'd tried and the shops they'd browsed. Marco rowed at his normal pace, and we made the crossing in exactly 15 minutes. He barely looked at me as I disembarked. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was projecting meaning onto a simple ferry ride because my life felt so empty of meaning that I was desperate to find it anywhere, even in the rowing speed of a stranger. But then it happened again. Thursday afternoon, I showed up at the dock with nowhere particular to be, no schedule to keep, just me and an old man with a fishing rod who fell asleep almost immediately after we pushed off, and Marco rowed slowly again, so slowly that I could count the individual ripples spreading from each stroke of the oars. 28 minutes that time. When we docked, the old man jerked awake, checked his watch, and didn't seem to register anything unusual. But Marco looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt something crack open in my chest. This became our pattern. On the days when I had appointments, when I needed to catch a specific bus or meet someone at a certain time, Marco rowed at normal speed. Professional, efficient, 15 minutes on the dot. But on the days when I showed up with nothing but time, when my body language must have broadcast my aimlessness, he rowed slower and slower, like he was giving me something I didn't know how to ask for. We didn't speak about it, not for weeks. Our conversations were limited to polite greetings, comments about the weather, the kinds of exchanges you have with someone whose face becomes familiar through repetition, but whose inner life remains a mystery. Except it didn't feel like a mystery. It felt like a secret we were both keeping, a conspiracy of slowness in a world that insisted everything move faster. I started timing my trips for the quiet hours, mid-morning on weekdays, late afternoon when the tourist crowds had thinned. I'd show up at the dock and Marco would be there, and something unspoken would pass between us, and he'd row like we had all the time in the world, because on those crossings, we did. It was early November when he finally spoke about it. The weather had turned cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones and makes you question why anyone would choose to live on an island. I was the only passenger, wrapped in a thick sweater that had belonged to my ex and that I kept meaning to throw away, but never did. Marco pushed off from the dock and began his slow rowing, each stroke measured and intentional. We were maybe 10 minutes into the crossing when he said, without looking at me, "My father used to say that a ferryman's job isn't just to move people from one place to another, it's to give them the crossing they need." I didn't respond right away. The water lapped against the sides of the boat, a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. "What kind of crossing do I need?" I asked finally. He pulled on the oars, slow and steady. The kind where you don't have to rush toward anything or run away from anything. The kind where you can just exist in the in-between for a while. Something about the way he said it, the gentleness in his voice, made my eyes sting. "How did you know?" "I see a lot of people on this ferry," he said. "Tourists who can't wait to get to the island. Locals who can't wait to get away from it. But you show up with nowhere to be, and you look like someone who's forgotten how to just be still. So I give you still. I give you slow." That's really kind," I managed, my voice rough. He did look at me then, his dark eyes searching my face. "It's not kindness, it's recognition. I know what it's like to need the world to slow down because you're afraid if it keeps spinning at normal speed, you'll fly right off it." We didn't talk for the rest of that crossing, but something had shifted. The silence between us was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people who had acknowledged seeing each other, really seeing each other, in a way that most people never do. After that day, we started talking more. Small conversations at first, trading information about our lives in careful increments. He told me about growing up on the island, about watching his father row the ferry every day, and knowing from the age of 5 that this would be his life too. Not because he had no other options, he was quick to clarify, but because there was something about the work that felt right. Something about being the person who facilitated transitions, who existed in that liminal space between departure and arrival. I told him about the city, about my career in advertising that had felt meaningful until suddenly it didn't. About the relationship that had ended not with a bang, but with a slow, sad recognition that we'd been holding on to something that had already died. About how I'd come to the island to figure out what came next, and had instead found myself stuck in an extended present tense, unable to imagine a future. "Maybe that's not stuck," Marco said one afternoon as he rowed us across the gray water. "Maybe that's just being present." "There's a difference between being present and being paralyzed," I countered. "Is there?" He pulled on the oars, his movements hypnotic in their consistency. "Or is that just something we tell ourselves because we're afraid that if we stop moving forward we'll disappear?" I didn't have an answer for that, but I thought about it for days afterward, turning his words over in my mind like smooth stones. Winter came to the island, bringing storms that sometimes canceled the ferry service for days at a time. On those days, I felt untethered, cut off from something essential. I told myself it was just cabin fever, the isolation of island life in the off-season. But I knew the truth. I missed Marco. I missed our slow crossings, our conversations that felt like they existed outside of normal time. I missed the way he looked at me, like I was someone worth seeing. It was during one of these storm-canceled stretches, 3 days of howling wind and sideways rain, that I finally admitted to myself what had been growing between us. I was in love with him. Not the desperate, consuming love I'd felt for my ex, the kind that burned hot and fast and left nothing but ash. This was different. This was slow and deep and patient, like the way Marco rode on the days I had nowhere to be. When the storms finally cleared and the ferry service resumed, I showed up at the dock with my heart in my throat. Marco was there, checking the boat for any damage from the rough weather. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and his face transformed. That almost smile became a real smile, bright and unguarded. "I missed you," he said, and the simplicity of it, the honesty, made me want to cry. "I missed you too," I replied, and then, because I'd spent 3 days trapped in my cottage, with nothing but my thoughts and I was done being careful, I added, "I've been missing you even when I see you every day." He went very still, his hand frozen on the rope he'd been coiling. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I come to the dock even when I don't need to go to the mainland. I'm saying that the best part of my day is when you row slowly. I'm saying that I think about you constantly and I don't know what to do about it, because I came here to figure out my life, and instead I'm falling in love with a ferryman's son." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. For a long moment Marco didn't move, didn't speak. I watched a dozen emotions cross his face, too quick for me to name. Then he said, "I started rowing slower because I wanted more time with you. Every crossing I'd hope you'd be there, and on the days you showed up with nowhere to be, I'd think, today I get to keep him a little longer, just a little longer. I've been falling in love with you since that first Tuesday in September, and I didn't know how to tell you because what do I have to offer? A life on an island, rowing the same route every day, existing in the in-between." "That's everything," I said, my voice breaking. "That's exactly what I need, the in-between, the slow. You." He crossed the distance between us in 3 strides and kissed me, his hands cupping my face like I was something precious and breakable. He tasted like salt air and coffee and coming home. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were shaking. "Come with me," he said. "Not on the ferry. Come with me." He led me along the dock to a small motorboat tied at the far end. "This is mine," he explained, "for when I'm not working, when I want to go somewhere just for the sake of going." We climbed in, and he started the motor, and we headed not toward the mainland, but out into the open water, parallel to the coast. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the sea into hammered silver. Marco navigated through the waves with easy confidence, and I sat beside him, our shoulders touching, and felt something inside me settle. He took us to a small cove on the uninhabited side of the island, a crescent of beach protected by high cliffs. We anchored the boat and waded to shore, and Marco spread out a blanket he kept stored under the seats. We sat together looking out at the water, and he took my hand. "I need you to understand something," he said. "This life, this island, it's not for everyone. It's small and quiet and sometimes boring. The winters are hard. There's not a lot of opportunity for career advancement in ferry operation." I laughed, surprising myself. "I don't want career advancement. I don't even know if I want a career anymore. I want to feel like my life means something, like I mean something." "You mean something to me," he said quietly. "You mean everything to me." We stayed in that cove for hours, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams, the ones he'd had as a kid about leaving the island and seeing the world, and how he'd realized eventually that the world came to him, passenger by passenger, story by story. I told him about my fear of commitment, of how I'd always been looking for the next thing, the better thing, unable to appreciate what I had until it was gone. "I don't want to be that person anymore," I said. "I don't want to keep rushing toward some imaginary future. I want to be here now with you." "Then stay," Marco said. "Stay on the island, stay with me." It should have felt too fast, too soon. We'd only been having real conversations for a few weeks, but it didn't feel fast. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like a decision I'd already made without realizing it. "Okay," I said. "Yes, I'll stay." That was 8 months ago. I'm writing this from the cottage I still rent, though Marco spends most nights here now, his toothbrush in my bathroom, his books mixed with mine on the shelves. We're looking for a place together, something bigger, maybe with a view of the harbor so we can watch the ferry come and go. I help out with the ferry service now, selling tickets and helping passengers with their luggage. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest work, and there's something deeply satisfying about being part of the rhythm of the island, about facilitating these small journeys that matter so much to the people taking them. Marco still rows slower on the days I'm a passenger instead of crew. It's become a joke between us, this thing that started as an unconscious kindness and became the foundation of everything we are together. Sometimes other passengers notice and complain about the crossing taking too long. Marco just smiles and says the current is strong today. The wind is against us. Any excuse that sounds plausible. But I know the truth. He's giving them what he gave me. Time, space, a chance to exist in the in-between. Last week, an older woman who's been coming to the island every summer for 30 years pulled me aside as she was disembarking. "That boy," she said, nodding toward Marco. "He rows different when you're on board. Slower, like he's trying to make the trip last." "I know," I told her. She patted my hand, her eyes twinkling. "Hold on to that one. A man who knows how to slow down for the people he loves, that's rare. That's precious." I already knew that, of course, but it was nice to have it confirmed by someone who'd been watching the ferry service longer than I had been alive. Sometimes people ask me if I miss the city, if I ever regret giving up my career, my old life. The honest answer is no. I don't miss the constant motion, the feeling of always running towards something or away from something else. I don't miss the person I was there, always anxious, always unsatisfied, always looking for the next thing to fill the emptiness inside me. Here on the island, with Marco, I've learned the value of slow. I've learned that life doesn't have to be a race toward some finish line, that sometimes the best moments are the ones that exist in transition, in the space between leaving and arriving. That love doesn't have to be a wildfire that consumes everything in its path. It can be a steady flame, warm and constant, something you tend to carefully because you know its value. Every morning, I watch Marco prepare the ferry for the day's first crossing. He moves with the same deliberate care he brings to everything, checking the ropes, testing the oars, scanning the horizon for weather. And every morning, I fall in love with him again, with his gentleness, his patience, his deep understanding that some things can't be rushed. We talk about the future sometimes, Marco and I, about maybe expanding the ferry service, adding a second boat, about the family we might have someday, children who'll grow up with salt in their hair and the rhythm of the oars in their blood. But mostly we talk about today, about the crossing ahead of us, about the passengers we'll carry and the stories they'll bring. Because that's what we've both learned, what we've taught each other. The present moment is enough. This crossing is enough. We are enough. And on the days when I have nowhere to be, when my only obligation is to exist, Marco still rows slower. He'll probably always row slower on those days. It's his way of saying, I love you without words. His way of giving me the thing I didn't know I needed until he offered it. Time. Unhurried, generous, abundant time. I never meant to fall in love with the ferryman's son, but now I can't imagine my life any other way. Can't imagine a future that doesn't include the sound of oars moving through water, the sight of Marco's shoulders working as he rows, the feeling of being suspended between one place and another, held in the safe space of transition. We're planning to get married next spring, right here on the island. A small ceremony on the beach, just family and close friends. Marco wants to arrive at the wedding by ferry, of course. He's already planning to row extra slowly that day, to make that final crossing as a single man last as long as possible before we step onto the shore and into our new life together. I asked him once why he does it, why he still slows down for me when we see each other every day, when we fall asleep together every night. He thought about it for a moment, his hand tracing patterns on my skin. Then he said, because every crossing with you is precious, because even though I know I get to keep you now, I never want to take that for granted, because love isn't about rushing toward forever. It's about savoring every moment along the way. That's Marco. That's the man I love, the ferryman's son who understood before I did that the journey matters just as much as the destination, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply more time. So yes, I fell in love with the ferryman's son, and he rows slower on the days I have nowhere to be. And that slowness, that deliberate, generous stretching of moments, that's where I found myself again. That's where I found home.